desert land has a way of retrieving itself, of reclaiming the land once used by man. But even as it paints over man's presence, memories remain. They called this spot the Jewel of the Desert. A few pages of American history were written here 45 years ago. What remains now are the memories and the lessons of what was once Utah's 5th largest city. A city ringed in barbed wire. A place known as Topaz. When Japanese attack planes ripped through the morning sky over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, much more was shattered than the Pacific Fleet of the United States. Gone was the innocence of Americans believing they could stay removed from distant battlefields. War came quickly and with dramatic certainty, reaching into every home in America.
And I always listened to the radio when, that's when I first heard the news that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and that we were in for the war. Now, that wasn't unexpected. Like I said, I think I had a real sense of relief that finally we were coming to grips with the problem.
Well, my brother and I were having breakfast. We turned on the radio and it said Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we looked at each other and said, uh-oh, we're in for it.
Before December 7th was over, the nation would take its first defensive steps, overseas and at home. Edward Ennis was the head of the Federal Alien Enemy Control Unit of the Justice Department. And before the flames had gone out at Pearl Harbor, he worked with FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover to execute a long-standing plan.
And he had prepared, in concert with attorneys in the department, lists of Germans and Japanese who should be arrested in case we got into war. So that program went into effect on Sunday night.
In the San Francisco Bay Area, teams of FBI agents and local police swept through Japanese population centers.
And when I came home about 5 o'clock in the evening, my father was gone. There was an FBI man posted in our home, and my mother and sister, who had been at home, told me that there were also 2 policemen, one at the front door and one at the back door. So they had been virtually under house arrest, not able to talk to anyone who called or to see anyone who called. And when I came home, I was suddenly faced with this situation, and it was just stunning, just a shock to realize that my father could be taken by the FBI so quickly. Their so-called crime was that they were leaders in the Japanese American community. They were teachers, heads of clubs, heads of associations. The FBI just virtually decimated the leadership of the Japanese American community.
At the outbreak of the war, close to 150,000 ethnic Japanese lived in America. The vast majority congregated in tight Nihonmachi, or Japanese towns, along the West Coast. Asian Americans had been perceived as a thorn in the side of states such as California since the turn of the century, and a web of laws targeted at an image of the yellow peril had evolved over time.
The Japanese couldn't become citizens, they couldn't own land, there were anti-miscegenation laws. Educational opportunities were limited. This is primarily, again, the first-generation immigrant. But you can almost see it's like an elevator where possibly there might be 10 floors and you can only go up to about the 2nd or the 3rd floor. And I think you can visualize what happens to people when they're caught under those kinds of conditions.
School dances and things like that, we never went to it because in the first place, they didn't accept you. If you go there, you probably sit on a chair all day long, you know. And even at times when we travel, we are aware of the fact that motels and hotels will not accept us.
Acceptance for ethnic Japanese on the West Coast had been painfully slow. The outbreak of war made it next to impossible. As images of San Francisco's Japanese lining up to turn over their cameras and radios became commonplace in the middle of December 1941, the West Coast Japanese, the majority of whom were American citizens by birth, felt opinion closing in.
In Watsonville, California, the Torigoye family, Dr. Torigoye lives here as a dentist now, but his father ran a sporting goods store. And he naturally had a sporting goods store with rifles and ammunition and fishing tackles. And so after Pearl Harbor, he went to the police department and told them, I have all this guns and ammunition. What shall I do? Oh, just leave it there. Well, you know what happened? They raided the place and it came out in the paper. Japs found with guns and ammunition.
We were at a school where I think there must have been a small minority of Japanese American kids. We looked across the room and we saw each other. And we sort of herded together because all of a sudden we thought that all of the American students were looking at us. And so it was that sort of frightening feeling that we may be targets for something.
We had to pull all the shades down, and we had to put black paper on the top so that no lights will shine out. They said otherwise if the lights shine out from our windows, we were signaling some Japanese airmen or something like that. And we said, well, that's stupid, you know, we used to say.
With each passing day, the clamor grew in the press and in Congress to do something about the West Coast Japanese problem. For General John DeWitt, the entire West Coast was a Japanese problem, since he was charged with defending the coast against the possibility of invasion by Japan. His original proposal was to remove all enemy aliens only in close proximity to defense installations. But soon a broader movement developed.
The general public was being aroused by the press, for example, to take action against the whole Japanese-American community. And apart from this patriotic fervor, if you want to call it that, there were very strong commercial and economic interests at work. The Farmer Growers Association had their eye on the farming activities of the Japanese, which were very successful.
When the attack on Pearl Harbor came, I think it gave what I would call the Japanese bashers, or at least those with very strong anti-Japanese tendencies, to think of this as a sort of a final solution.
The Department of Justice would not participate in such a program because we thought it was factually unnecessary. And this was at least one occasion in which Mr. Hoover, the head of the FBI, agreed with us. He said he had no evidence of possible sabotage or espionage by the local Japanese-American community.
In arguing for a total evacuation order, General DeWitt reasoned, quote, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken." Sensing military urgency and the need to back his commanders, Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. The days were numbered for ethnic Japanese on the West Coast, alien and citizen alike.
The feeling that America had turned its back on us. There was that feeling that here we were, we didn't commit any crime, we didn't do anything wrong, and they don't evacuate the Germans, they don't evacuate the Italians, but the Japanese are evacuated.
San Francisco would be one of the first cities affected. Its strategic location, coupled with a rapidly mobilizing string of naval, air, and military bases, made it a hub for national defense. But before a formal evacuation was ordered, the Japanese would be given a brief opportunity to get out under their own power. By the thousands, West Coast Japanese turned to Utah as an emergency answer. A tolerant atmosphere developed by early Mormon church missionary work in Japan had nurtured small and tightly knit Japanese communities in Salt Lake City and Ogden. But if the door appeared open in Utah, it quickly slammed shut.
Utah had just gone through a terrible agricultural and mining depression during the 1920s and 1930s. And there were jobs, and they were fearful that any big group coming in from the outside might take jobs that otherwise Utahns could have.
The depressed economy, coupled with the patriotic fervor of the war, produced a bitter reaction to arriving Japanese. At the state capitol, Governor Herbert Maw listened to an angry public.
And a lot of them assumed that anyone who was a Japanese of Japanese descent would be an enemy and would be loyal to the Japanese. So that was the attitude of most of the people around here.
The governor received a barrage of mail. Labor organizations, veterans groups, and city councils fired off resolutions to Herbert Maw, warning the governor to keep out the Japs. This noteworthy letter came from the Ogden, Utah chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, stating, quote, "We emphatically and sincerely oppose the entrance and settlement of these people," claiming the West Coast Japanese would disturb and disrupt the good reputation of Utah Japanese. To arrive at a consensus, Governor Maw called a meeting of county officials in his Capitol Hill boardroom on March 16, 1942.
They were very reluctant to have people come into their county. If they were a problem on the Pacific Coast, why wouldn't they be a problem here?
When put to a vote, every county represented told the governor to tell the Japanese to stay out of Utah. Not accepted in the interior, and knowing they could be ordered off the West Coast at any time, Japanese in San Francisco waited for the other shoe to drop. They didn't wait long. Late in March of 1942, exclusion orders began to appear on telephone poles and billboards near Japantown.
I remember Doc come running home crying, said, "Did you see those signs that were all pasted on the telephone pole saying that we were evacuating, we were going someplace else, and you can only take what you can carry in 2 hands."
And I couldn't understand this. I read this over and over again. What do they mean? Non-alien, Japanese aliens and non-aliens. What do you mean, non-aliens? You know, what is this euphemistic term? And I'm an American. What is this non-alien?
Just like having a bucket of cold water thrown in your face to think that our own country was going to really do this thing to us. And then, of course, we had this deadline. We had 10 days to get ready to move and to pack and to get out.
The Army got a list of all the names of the people. And then they gave me their names, and I had to find them and go to their places and talk to them. And I felt sorry for them. If you want to know, I kind of felt sorry for them. And they felt sorry, too.
Of course, everyone had the problem of getting rid of their personal belongings, selling. Well, the people in California Street had to sell the refrigerator for $5. Things like that, you know, because 2 days' notice, what can you do?
That which could not be sold was stored. Entire households stacked up on city streets as the day for departure drew near. On Assembly Day, Yoshiko Uchida trooped off with her mother and sister, recording her departure in her relocation memoir, Desert Exile.
We were too tense and exhausted to fully sense the terrible wrench of leaving our home. And when we arrived at the church, we said our goodbyes quickly. I didn't even turn back to wave, for we were quickly absorbed into the large crowd of Japanese that had already gathered on the church grounds. It wasn't until I saw the armed guards standing at each doorway, their bayonets mounted and ready, that I realized the full horror of the situation.
I guess the first time that I say, God, it is actually happening is when we had to get on the bus and the military with the guns told us to get on the bus to go to Tamparan. And I said, oh my God, it is finally happened, it's true. Until that time, I kept saying to myself, it just can't happen to us.
The buses did not rumble far in March and April of 1942. Just outside of San Francisco, in the suburb of San Bruno, was the Tanforan racetrack. The ethnic Japanese took the place of thoroughbreds in the horse stalls.
And we're coming in, and they would not let us out of the bus until, and I turned around to look until that gate was closed and locked. And then we were allowed to get them out of the locked, out of the locked buses.
we got off, and the men and the women were separated. And men went one way and the women went another way, and we were examined, you know, with a flashlight for smallpox and in the mouth, and then we were asked to strip and felt us around, and that we didn't have any terrible disease or something, I guess.
The day we got there, it was pouring rain, and we had to walk through mud, almost ankle to knee deep, carrying whatever we could carry, and they assigned us living quarters, and ours happened to be in the barrack 13, where they had this a horse stall.
So when we got to our stable and opened the door, here was this dark, filthy horse stall with dust and dirt and wood shavings on the floor and the smell of manure in the air. Two little small windows in front and partitions between each stall, which didn't rise all the way to the roof, so there was this whole area of open space all along the stable through which every sound traveled, so that we could hear things that were going on in several stalls, adjacent stalls.
It was very, very, I don't know what kind of word to use, but by God, what a place they're going to put us, you know.
Just sat there for a while in the dark on this cot with just springs. We opened it up and put it up and just sat there for a long. We could hear people crying and down the stable.
I think the first experience I felt was going to the mess hall, and now I know why they call it a mess hall. Standing in line, and we had all brought our tin cups and plates, you know, and our own utensils, and standing in line at I remember that was mess hall 12, and we were right near the barbed wire fence there. And all the cars were zooming by as we stood in line at Tanforan. That feeling, it was a pretty hard feeling to have right there, just standing in line with that tin cup.
Our children will often play house in nursery school and set the table and have a father come home from work and so forth. But in camp, very shortly after they arrived, when they played house, the children would stand in line with a plate at a mess hall, and that became their reality for them.
My mother told me that this is our world now. And I remember to this day what she said, and tried to think of why she said it. And I have a feeling that she meant it as the umbilical cord from Japan to America has now been severed.
In fact, little kids, I heard one child say, I want to go back to America. I don't want to be in Japan.
And when I went to Tanforan, I really felt like I must be Japanese. I mean, it's like a revelation, you know, that it never crossed my mind before, that I was any different from anybody else on the block or at school.
Mary Kimura found herself in a unique position. A Portuguese immigrant, she had married a Japanese immigrant. When the evacuation order came, it said simply, your children go to Tanforan. But since you're not Japanese, you stay in San Francisco.
So I don't know if my children go. I want to go. But you don't have to go. You don't go. It's the children's. That time my husband wasn't here yet. They go, I go. No, I said yes. I fight. Oh, I fought quite with him, this big guy, but to make a difference. Well, if you go, you have to sign the papers. I said, sure. I sign any paper you want, but my children's go, I go.
Mary Kimura won the fight. The next day, her family moved into a Tanforan horse stall together. As spring passed to summer in 1942, federal officials began considering a permanent housing solution for the West Coast Japanese. Criteria were simple. A permanent site had to be based on public land, away from the West Coast, and away from population centers. Utah was back in the picture. Very quietly, federal officials had come to Utah early in February of 1942. Far in advance of any formal declaration of relocation, agents of the War and Justice Departments were scouting potential sites for holding centers for the West Coast Japanese. They found what they were looking for in the desolate rangeland of the Great Basin here in western Utah. In one of the many ironies of war, to make room for the uprooted ethnic Japanese from California who were ordered here, some residents of this hard Millard County land found themselves ordered out. Sherman Tolbert had just settled onto a small farm in Millard County. It wasn't much, but it was what Tolbert and his wife had dreamed of.
It was the next spring. There was a man came to our place, and he just told us that he'd come to appraise our property. I didn't know exactly what was happening at the time. When we got back to his car, he says, "Well, Mr. Tolbert," he says, "you'll get a letter in a few days of what I've appraised your property at." And he says, "and then you'll have 30 days after that to move. And what you don't take will belong to the government."
The federal government condemned Sherman Tolbert's land to make room for the Central Utah War Relocation Center, which would house residents of the Tanforan racetrack. In a matter of weeks, construction started, and the camp had picked up a nickname from a nearby mountain, Topaz. The rumor mill worked overtime in the Tanforan horse stalls about a pending relocation. Late in August of 1942, Tanforan was ordered to move out to Utah.
But here we were going on to this. First of all, it was at dusk, and there it came to me. Why do we have to be sent out at dusk? Do we have to be sent out at nightfall so nobody could see us? And then this one part of the camp was opened up so that there was no way of getting in contact or be seen by the public. And it opened right up to the tracks.
And we marched to the train, which was right out of this back gate, and each group had a captain. And then we were put on this ancient, rickety train. I don't know where they found it. It was gas-lit. And we had to have the curtains down. It was complete blackout.
In our train, they went past Reno, in the middle of this godforsaken desert, and they said, "Okay, you can get out and stretch your legs, but first the Army had to have a skirmish line about 100 yards out there." And they let us off. And where would you go? You're in the middle of the desert anyway.
We were treated like prisoners. We had a car captain who supervised things. We were not allowed to leave our car except once a day, when we could walk up and down the length of the train. And there was a lot of physical illness, people who became car sick, and you can imagine the filth in the bathrooms, and it was just a very unpleasant, uncomfortable journey.
Train after train rolled down the tracks through western Utah, bringing over 8,000 men, women, and children to rail sidings in the tiny town of Delta.
And I remember looking through the windows at them, because I walked out there and looked, and it was frightening to me to see all of those Japanese people sitting there, well-dressed people sitting there in the trains.
So we stepped down, and we found that we're not even into the train, into the station. We had to step over the tracks and onto the gravel to get to this, where we saw a whole bunch of trucks and waiting for us, Army trucks waiting for us. And then finding myself, climbing into the back of a truck that's covered over so that no one could see us again, with a lot of strangers and all Japanese faces, and everybody's looking glum, silent, no one's talking.
And then we saw all this dust, in the air. And I said, we must be coming to something. And we saw this, suddenly in all this dust, we see the fence poles and the Army towers. And then all this rolls of black tar-papered, city. As soon as we got off, all this white alkali dust and the wind just blowing, we were like we fell in a flour barrel. And then we could hear the Berkeley Boy Scout band playing Hail California. And the whole thing is insane.
Well, they didn't have to talk. You could look at them and tell, it's a sad thing, war. And you could tell that they weren't, they weren't on a party.
And to see barbed wire and sentries, I think, where are we going? What do we need to be locked in like this, in this wide open, wild place?
But Topaz was totally isolated, and I think that's the first time I started thinking, gee, I think they hate us.
And as I think about the barbed wire and the guard towers, I think that we were living in a manifestation of mankind's hatred and fear and distrust.
You see, they had dug up the desert to build that camp. And so what normally would have been just a very hard surface was all dust, very fine dust. I call it like Cody face powder. And no matter where you stepped, it was that white, fine dust. And as we went to our processing barrack, I still remember that white dust all over the place.